Dr. Scott C. Core. I am a licensed health service psychologist here in the state of Oklahoma, and I'm the director of Renew Counseling Center, which is a part of Southern Nazarene University. It is a community and university counseling clinic, and I'm a professor in the graduate programs in counseling at SNU as well. And I am with you today to do what we call mental health minutes, which are these short, digestible, 10-minute discussions and information sessions about different mental health topics that I believe often get folks into difficult spaces in which, again, things like suicidal ideation and behaviors become more possible. And so what we're trying to do is kind of have conversations related to these ideas and start to understand the triggers for why people start to struggle. Today is going to be related to post-traumatic stress disorder and how we can start to mobilize without fear. And some of this is taken, actually quite a bit of it is taken from a psychologist that I've studied quite a bit named Stephen Porges, who does a lot of work with PTSD. And I recommend looking at his stuff because a lot of what he does with PTSD is outstanding. But essentially, PTSD is something that I've worked with quite a bit. It's what my dissertation was on. It's what I worked with quite a bit when I was at the VA Medical Center. And so I've done a lot of work with folks that have been through trauma. And in post-traumatic reactions, the first thing I want people to understand are often instinctual, and they're often valuable in the face of real threat. However, they're very primitive, and they're often misused in our day-to-day irritations, I would say. So often these very primitive, survival-based mechanisms, while very helpful, are often overused in situations where they're not needed as much, okay? And so what is PTSD? Well, I'm gonna give you the DSM-5 diagnosis criteria here for a second, so bear with me, but it's a mental health condition that is representing an individual being stuck in time, essentially emotionally and behaviorally, resulting from a terrifying event that was experienced or witnessed. And I say stuck in time because a lot of times what happens is our brains get captured in those moments because they were so prominent in our memories. And we start to react to things in our day-to-day that feel very similar, even though we know they're not on some levels, and we're not able to get past them. And it results in things like re-experiencing the event, avoidance of any triggers that might make us feel the same way, over-arousal and reactivity, and then depressive and negative symptoms, okay? And you essentially have to have all of these to qualify for a PTSD diagnosis. And so essentially we've heard these terms before, fight or flight mechanisms. So if we feel an event, person, or the world is safe, we're going to engage in social engagement. We're not going to activate the fight or flight process. But if we feel that an event or a person or a situation is dangerous, fight or flight's going to kick in. If we feel it's life-threatening, sometimes we'll have the shutdown process happen, which is historically called freeze, okay? So what we're going to talk about is how that threat process works in the brain and how we can repurpose it essentially, okay? And so this activation system is essentially permitting excitation and it's increasing inflammation. One of the things I've really loved learning as a psychologist over time is the medical idea behind some of mental health distress and recognizing that a lot of mental health distress is an inflammation process in the body and an inflammation process in the brain. And what that means is a lot of times you're going to feel it physically. It's sickness behavior in some ways. And this inflammation is actually very effective as a defensive process. So essentially what that means is inflammation is good in the acute, but it is not good chronically. Chronic inflammation like PTSD leads to a lot of problems, emotional, cognitive like memory issues, and problematic behaviors. And what's interesting is you can't keep them separated. Mind and body respond together to threat. And that means that it's not just our brains, it's going to be our bodies responding as well, okay? And so what Stephen Porges talks about, which I really love, is how to mobilize without fear, okay? One of the examples that I have kind of used with this is my dogs. I have 2 dogs, and they wrestle around in our backyard quite a bit. And if you look at them, it looks like they're fighting, but they're actually playing. They're biting at one another, they're tussling around, but they don't break the skin. So what are they doing? Well, some folks might say, well, they're practicing their hunting skills, right? Actually, they're not. They're practicing co-regulation. So instead of practicing the hunting skills, they are practicing co-regulation, which is actually taking that mobilization and repurposing it for something helpful. This is what kiddos do when they play. Play is a repurposing of the mobilization in a healthy way. So if we can access that part of our brains, that mobilization without fear, we can start to feel safe instead of threat, and we can reverse those threat reactions. Now, This does not remove the threat, but it essentially repurposes it in a lot of ways. So what does threat then become? Well, fight or flight can actually become play, which I love that idea that actually learning how to play can actually utilize that mobilization piece in a more healthy way. Shutdown then becomes intimacy. So that freeze response results in, instead of being something that's causing me to be stuck in time, it's causing me to be more open to intimate moments. Well, how do we get to those particular places, and what are our take-homes for this? Well, I think the main thing is that we've got to recognize that, again, PTSD is an inflammation process in the brain. And this means that it's very biological. Why that's important is because I've worked with a lot of patients who see it as a moral failure a lot of times, or a weakness, that I can't get over this reaction. And what I always tell them is like, your brain's doing what it's supposed to do. It recognized and it kept you alive in a lot of really potentially problematic situations by activating. The problem is it's feeling things in the day-to-day now that are not actually life-threatening are the same as what you experienced when you experienced the trauma. And your brain is essentially trying to do what it's doing, but it's doing it in problematic ways, okay? And chronic post-traumatic stress disorder is going to result in a misperception of the self and the environment. So again, in some of our other talks, we've talked about how we feel things sometimes, but we don't actually see them. Chronic PTSD results in a really heavy response state, a feeling state. And often what that means is we're not evaluating the environment in accurate ways. It becomes more instinctual behaviors. So to change that process, we need to figure out how to repurpose that activation and that mobilization piece. We have to give ourselves space between the stimulus and the response, okay? So the stimulus that causes us to react and then we just automatically respond, we've got to give ourselves space between that response to help learn how to mobilize through play, through intimacy. And now what we're able to do is we can choose. Well, how do we do that process? That can be therapy. That can be things like physical activity. That can be deep breathing. That can be just going for a walk periodically. The ability to be able to start to go, I'm sensing something and my body's reacting and it thinks it's threat, but is it threat? And if I can give myself just enough space between that stimulus response, I get a chance for all parts of my brain to come online and start to evaluate if this is actually something I need to be afraid of. And if it's not, how do I lean into more healthy ways to deal with it? Hope this has been helpful. Thank you for listening.